When it comes to weight loss, no two people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't outtrain her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Ready for the next level of cybersecurity? October is Cybersecurity Month, and Gartner is building cybersecurity resilience in a complex world. From AI, new to role, identity and access management, to mid-size enterprise, government, and beyond. Join the Security and Risk Management Summit 2025, the largest cybersecurity conference in North America. Pre-register at Gartner.com/US/security risk. That's Gartner.com/US/security risk.
Pursuing your future doesn't end at 40. In fact, it may mark the beginning of knowing who you are, what you're capable of, and what you really want. But knowing what's next and how to get there can be a challenge, especially when old narratives play on repeat. Liberty Road is here to share stories so that you can consider your possibilities, pursue your purpose, and move into your future with intention. I'm your host, Netta Jones, and we're here to listen, learn, and liberate dreams, one episode at a time. Well, hello, Liberty listeners. Welcome to another episode of Liberty Road. Today, you guys get to unpack with me, because I'm so curious about this subject, the topic of ADHD with a woman that I've known actually for many years, but who has stepped into this space more recently with her platform, It's ADHD-Friendly. Caren Magill, welcome to the show. It's so fun to have you.
Great to be here, and it's good to see you again.
Good to see you as well. So first of all, let's just talk about what is this platform you've created called It's ADHD-Friendly?
The platform itself is... It was born from my own late diagnosis. I was diagnosed with ADHD at 50, which was, of course, 2020, and everybody was struggling that year. But a lot of my struggles, that meeting, the hormonal explosion of perimenopause, just became a little bit too much for me. So I sought help, and the help ended up coming back as this diagnosis, which I had pretty much assumed I had because I knew other people with it. So usually when you hear other people's stories, you start to realize that the struggles you have, you're not alone in. So that was 2020, and it was a very pivotal moment for me. It was also a time in my life where I had moved back. Well, I had been in entrepreneurship several times throughout my career, which is how we came to know each other.
That's right.
But I had also gone back to corporate several times, and I was consulting at LinkedIn at the point when I got my diagnosis, and I was really ready to come back into entrepreneurship. But I didn't want to just move back into entrepreneurship without, a compelling vision of what it is I want to do, because I've tried that one in the past and it doesn't always end up well. But so when I had this diagnosis, it was sort of like this beautiful point where I was ready to change. I was ready to pivot my career. I was ready for growth in a way where I was going to learn everything I could about this. I call it a disorder. Some people would call it a trait, and also how I could thrive with it. A big piece of who I am is always looking for the opportunity for growth and learning, gratitude and hope. Those are my character strengths. So with all of those things, I had this idea for a new career pivot, and that was to get into ADHD coaching, which was starting to become very popular as more and more adults are getting diagnosed later in life. So, and I had been thinking about moving into coaching. The idea of just life coaching in general wasn't really appealing to me. So when all of these sort of different pieces, moving pieces dovetailed in together, it just felt like a beautiful opportunity to try something that was not only a big interest for me now, but something that was personally relevant for me. So long story short, I then pivoted out of my consulting role at LinkedIn and decided to, I got credentialed as an ADHD coach and decided to start coaching. And I started one-on-one coaching, and I did that for a couple of years. It's hard to say, even to hear myself say a couple of years, because 2020 feels like it was 2 days ago.
I know. Isn't it weird? Yeah.
Yes, it is. And as I was coaching, I was also building my own social platforms to market my coaching. But what happened is that I, first of all, loved building these platforms even more than I loved coaching, because it gave me the opportunity to learn more about ADHD and share it with a broader number of people, rather than one-on-ones where you're only seeing transformation in the person ahead of you or in front of you. And coaching is not accessible to a lot of folks, especially ADHDers, who tend to be chronically unemployed, or not chronically underemployed. I shouldn't say unemployed. So I saw value in building the platform rather than going the one-on-one route. And I haven't looked back since then. So really the platform is partly my journey, partly everything I've learned in my coaching practice and my coaching education, and also my special sauce, which is coming into this with the energy of hope and curiosity, and looking to take what I have in this set of traits and leverage it rather than look at it as a deficit. And a lot of conversations about ADHD, rightfully so, focus on the problem, but I always want to be focused on the solution. And I also want to take it from the frame of being late diagnosed, because a lot of folks are diagnosed when they're 12, they grow up with ADHD, and that's great for them. But when you get a diagnosis at, in your 50s, it feels like you're getting the playbook to life 30 years too late, right? And you've got to deal with the fact that you're learning about this so later in life, and that there's so much grief around what could have been different if you knew earlier and you had the right support and treatment. But it is what it is, and you got to move forward from there. So that is where the whole platform came from and why I'm so passionate about it.
I can imagine how hard it would be to get that diagnosis late. It's funny, when you were first saying it, I actually thought, oh my gosh, there's a whole new lease on life. Like you have this new understanding of what can be. And I don't say that to diminish, or I don't mean to diminish what could have been, because I can totally appreciate how difficult that would be. But as so much is happening in midlife, for women, it is hormonal, in addition to all the other things around us that are changing, whether it's aging parents, or rethinking some of the decisions we've made, or empty nesting, or just even having kids that are growing up and don't need as much of our time, making the decision to not have kids, and being at a place now where like that's not an active decision anymore. That decision is that has been made. And dealing with all of these things, it's just one more thing in this basket of relearning who we are and what we want out of life. How did that inform the next iteration of Caren Magill? Even though I know you said at the time you were with LinkedIn, how did that inform your personal decision to rethink how you were living your life, never mind the professional decision to go back into entrepreneurship?
It changed everything. That's a great question. It certainly, I think, work led that exploration, but so many things changed in my personal life. And it's hard to pinpoint exactly where the diagnosis ends and being in my 50s begins, right? So it changes your personal relationships in the sense that you start to realize that some relationships are just not worth the energy or, the investment anymore. So you start to rethink about it. And I know that sounds like a very confronting thing, but it's also a very important thing, like very often the friendships that we build through life, maybe they're from college or different times of life that are no longer relevant, or so it's not that there's anything wrong with you or the other person, but you realize that the friendships that I'm investing so much time and energy into don't necessarily align with my interests, my current energy, and also who I am as a neurodivergent who tends to take things. One of the big aspects of ADHD is rejection sensitive dysphoria, which is like an accelerated sense of hurt when you either have been in some way rejected or it's a perceived rejection. It doesn't even have to be like a full rejection. And you start to realize patterns in your relationships where, if you text somebody and you don't hear back from them, and, that's just life. Sometimes people are too busy to text back. But if there's one friend where you're always kind of left questioning what's going on here, and I'm always feeling a little hurt afterwards, those relationships I started to look at through the lens of what I now understood to be a part of who I am. I always knew I was very sensitive, but now I had some language around it. So with that new frame of mind, I was able to look at friendships and think, I don't need to ditch anybody, but how I invest my time and energy is probably going to change based on how the people around me make me feel or how I feel about the time that we spend together. So that was a big part of it. And how I set up my house, what became important to me in terms of what I did throughout the day. Wellness and taking care of myself became such a huge priority, because if I'm underslept or if I haven't moved, like movement's very important to brain function, I started to notice that there was things that practices that I was neglecting, it would show up in my lack of focus and lack of ability to follow through on things. So shifting priorities across my life became so important. And while that was not easy, it was so game-changing. And I don't even recognize the person I was 4 or 5 years ago now.
Wow. Did the diagnosis feel like not only validation, but an opportunity to rethink, to re-examine these things in your life, like relationships, like the way you were living, like your wellness and fitness and, I think you said movement, sort of routine. Did it feel like, oh, now I have an excuse? Like now I can carve this out and be intentional about it? Or did it feel necessary? Like now I know that I need this to kind of nourish my life and who I am.
I would say both. And I mean, I think that was a very astute way of putting it, because I think especially women, we almost have to justify putting ourselves first sometimes. So on the one hand, it did give me that permission that now that I know this about myself, if I want to have, yes, I'm in my 50s, but I still believe that I have a lot of life to live. And however much time I have left, I want it to be the best quality of life possible. So that gives me permission to put my needs first. And it's also evidence for me that I don't have to feel bad about it. I shouldn't have to feel bad about it anyway. But let's be honest, our culture doesn't necessarily always give us permission to put our oxygen mask on first, even though, culturally, we tend to speak to it in those terms, but it's hard to follow.
Yeah.
But it gave me that extra permission. So yes, it really was a game changer in that respect.
Thank you for taking my word excuse and making it permission. That's a much better way, and the way we should be looking at it, really.
Sure.
Tell us a little bit, just to get into the ADHD language, like just you talking about sensitivity. That was new to me. That's something I didn't know. Tell us what some of the maybe markers are of somebody that has ADHD that we don't know. I think we all hear it and we think of that crazy little boy in the classroom who can't sit still, and we don't really know what to do with it as an adult. And then I want to back into some of that too, how we're finding out more and more as adults and in peri and menopause too. But first, what are some of those indicators that maybe we're not aware of?
Sure. And I think you're absolutely right on. We always assume that it's somebody who's running around, and they're usually 12.
Yeah.
First of all, with girls younger in life, they often go undiagnosed because they don't express or behave in that hyperactive way. And if they're not disruptive, then you don't necessarily see what's happening on the inside. So and I will say one key thing about ADHD versus the very common traits that we all experience sometimes. The difference, the defining piece that makes ADHD a diagnosis versus, you just have these particular traits is it has to be prolonged and pervasive. So very often if you go in for testing, they'll want to know, what your childhood was like, because it's a brain development disorder. So it's usually expressed early on. Now, there is a lot of conversations happening now around adult onset ADHD based on either brain injuries and things like that, but I'll put that aside for a second.
Okay.
So if you're a woman listening to this right now in midlife thinking, maybe I have this, generally as a child, you would have been feeling like you had to work a little bit harder to understand things, and some things just absolutely did not make sense, and you could not make your brain figure them out, because an ADHD brain and nervous system is wired towards interest. So if something is interesting to us, then we can be hyper-focused and we can go 10 times faster than anybody else. But we don't necessarily have agency over what we're interested in. That's why, a lot of kids can spend hours and hours and hours paying attention to video games, but not their homework, because they don't necessarily have the choice of where their brain finds interest and has enough dopamine to follow through on the thing. So the characteristics then can be interest, but not agency around interest. Also, not being able to follow through on things. So you're interested in something for a short period of time, and then it loses its interest, and your brain, you just don't have enough dopamine to keep going with the thing. So very short attention spans, very short interest spans, a lot of impulsivity due to underdeveloped prefrontal lobes. So basically the key marker of ADHD is your frontal lobes, where all your executive functions are, which is planning, organization, prioritization, emotional regulation. Those things develop at a slower rate than a neurotypical child. So you might be a little bit more immature, usually around 3 to 4 years from a maturity standpoint, behind your peers. And also, as a result of that, if you're, not treating that ADHD even into adulthood, your impulsivity, your decision-making might be somewhat impaired because of that deficiency in the frontal lobe. So it's hard to plan. It's hard to look at things that you need to get done in your day and understand what's the most important thing and what's not so important. You get very easily overwhelmed when it comes to things like organization. And from an emotional regulation standpoint, you can get so overwhelmed with emotion when you're put in a situation where your brain is just not working for you that you can have a meltdown or, again, RSD. I think there is a statistic that an ADHD child gets 20,000 more reprimands or negative feedback than the average neurotypical child growing up. So you can understand where that rejection sensitivity starts to build up. We get so much extra feedback that we're not doing things right, or we did something wrong, or we forgot something, or misunderstood something. So we're very sensitive to feedback. So those are sort of the hallmarks of what you would see as an adult and as a child.
You just said something I'm not familiar with. Did you say RSD?
Rejection sensitive dysphoria.
Okay. Thank you. Yes,
acronym.
thank you. You brought it up at the top of the conversation. Thank you for that. That's super helpful. And I'm sure there are lots of people listening that are having a moment of like, this sounds familiar. Quickly, you talked about 3 or 4 years, I think you said, of maturity, like relative to your peers, especially in those early ages. I think that really stands out quite a bit. Is that maturity just in learning, or is that social maturity or emotional maturity as well? Like, could you have been a highly sensitive but also very mature emotional child, and then that would have been missed? I'm thinking of girls in particular.
Okay. So one thing about ADHD is it rarely comes along alone, right? There's always like comorbid conditions like depression or anxiety and other things that layer on top of the experience, right? So when we're thinking about maturity, it's very difficult to pull away like what is considered mature or not mature, but just to touch upon the 3 things that you mentioned. And I am by far not the most expert person there is around ADHD, but I've learned a lot about this. When it comes to learning, as I mentioned, if an ADHD child or adult is interested in the content of whatever they're learning, Their learning abilities are as good as anyone else's, like as a neurotypical person. And then there's twice exceptional folks, meaning that they are gifted and also ADHD. So ADHD is a thinking disorder, not necessarily a learning disorder. Not to say that there can't also be learning disorders. But one of the things that I've heard Dr. Russell Barkley, who is one of the experts in the field, has sort of articulated this idea of ADHD being that like the learning mechanisms of your brain is in the back of your brain. And the prefrontal cortex, where I mentioned like execution skills, are in the front of your brain. And with ADHDers, there's like, somebody takes a machete to midway through your brain and chops off, the connection between the learning and the doing. And the frustrating piece about having this disorder is that because you are just as capable as anybody else to learn things and the things, but you can't get yourself to do the things, makes it that much more frustrating, which is why so many adults with ADHD will claim that they're not reaching their potential because they know they're just as smart as everybody else, but it's in the execution that they struggle. And if there's enough support around them, they can move forward, but they need to find their own way to do that.
And that frustration as a child and as a, going through adolescence and into your, 20, 25, late adolescence is maddening, right?
Yeah.
It'd be so frustrating if you didn't know what it was and how to deal with it. Even if you did have an early diagnosis, it would be very frustrating. So let's skip a little bit ahead to the 50-year-old woman, that woman that you met when you were in the beginnings of COVID and said, okay, I've got to sort of figure this out. What testing do you go do? Who do you talk to say, I need to get tested to see if this is something that I have? And then where do you go from there? Like, what do you do with that new information? Let's start with where do you get tested?
Okay. Well, the interesting thing, and one of the main reasons why so many adults are now getting diagnosed, the primary reason why that's happening is, number one, it is so much more well known in the education space, so teachers can identify it and pediatricians can identify it. So when parents bring their kids into the pediatrician saying, they're struggling and the teacher said it might be ADHD, they get a diagnosis. And as the pediatrician is explaining to them the experience, they're like, oh my gosh, that was me. So you might think as a parent, well, that's, what everybody deals with. But it turns out that no, it's what you and your child deals with because you both have ADHD. It's a 70% heredity rate. I think that's how you say it. Yeah. Meaning that if you have ADHD, there's a 70% chance that you're going to pass that along to your children as well. So that is why there's such a prevalence in, especially women getting diagnosed, and it's because their kids are getting diagnosed as well. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the end all be all. So for example, I don't have children. I sat and listened to a podcast of somebody else explaining their experience with ADHD, and I had my holy crap moment. That's how I am. That's my brain. And that was the moment where I thought, maybe this is me too. And that's how I sought a diagnosis. So I know there's going to be people listening to this podcast that are thinking exactly that right now, whether they have kids or not. And my advice to them would be start with your GP if they're here in the US. Because the thing is, getting a diagnosis, depending on where you live and what access you have to healthcare, is going to be different for everyone. But a GP is a great place to start. Maybe if you're in the United States and you need a referral, that's a good place to start. But if you go to your GP and they say, well, you can't have ADHD because, you're holding down a job, or if they say anything to the effect of, based on what I know about you, you can't have ADHD, find yourself somebody else, because most
Sure.
GPs do not get the education and they are running with a very small assumption of what ADHD is. And if you can find a psychologist or a therapist or a psychiatrist, even better, they're probably going to have a lot more idea of the symptoms. Somebody who has knowledge of ADHD is going to be helpful. So if you're not satisfied with the first response you get, don't let that be the end of it. You know yourself better than a doctor you might see like twice a year. But that's where I would start.
It's a good word. And I mean, gosh, in talking about menopause a couple times on this podcast, it's reminding me of that. Like if your GP doesn't know, that was probably a seminar they missed in college because it wasn't something people focused on. So keep pushing, keep advocating for yourself, keep asking. Is the test like is this 10 questions, and depending on how you answer it, they're likely to say, okay, we need to further test? Or is this something where they're attaching things to your brain to see how things function?
Right. That's a great question, because there's a number of different ways. The formality around a formal diagnosis is whether or not you meet the DSM-5 criteria, which is the psychological criteria for ADHD as an adult, which includes at this point, how did you behave as a child? But the testing process is different across the board. You might have a doctor who pulls up a standardized test on their computer, and they'll ask you a bunch of questions. And if you answer yes to the majority of them, then, they'll say, okay, you probably have ADHD. Let's talk about treatment. And I'll get to treatment in a second. What I got was I went to a psychologist who's trained in testing for neurological deficiencies. And she did a formal test, which included things that tested, my attention span. They were all things like, press every time you see an X come up on the screen, click something. You know what I mean? Like they're behavioral things, and like spatial understanding. I got tested for a whole bunch of stuff. And then there's also like a lot of, I think there was like 800 question survey I had to fill out. And they also like getting surveys of other people in your family that knew you when you were a child. So they can run the gamut in terms of testing. And there are some tests. I would just do a quick search. If you're curious, start with a quick search for ADHD test used by doctors, and you will get a number of different things. Make sure that it's not sponsored and somebody trying to sell you medication on the back end of it. But I think Harvard had a survey, and a few other different places where you can find surveys and just take them to see what feedback you get. It's not diagnostic, but it's a good starting place, right? Where you can start to think about first of all, it gives you more indication of what ADHD is, and it will give you an indication of how you line up to the challenges, and then you can take a next step. But there should be some query, some reflection, and I don't think anybody ever gets probes stuck to their head, although Dr. Amen, who is more of like an influencer at this point than a practitioner, he does do brain scans, and you would probably see, on a brain scan, you would see low activity in the frontal lobes of somebody who has ADHD but isn't treated. But generally, people do not get their brain scanned for a diagnosis.
Okay, that's super helpful. Thank you. Gosh, we already have some like takeaways here. I love it. So going back to the 50-year-old woman, most of the women who are listening to this podcast are in their 40s, 50s, 60s. And brain fog for many is a symptom of menopause or a symptom of this time in life. I've heard a variety of things on that particular subject. But how do we know what's what? Like, how do we know if this is just, something I'm dealing with and I'm like, gosh, is this some sort of early onset anything? Like, do I have to be concerned about this being Alzheimer's or something else? Or is it brain fog? And how are we supposed to know? Like, could it be brain fog, or is it ADHD, or do they present very differently?
Yeah, it's tough because when you say brain fog, like that's going to be different for everyone, right? It's your brain is not working the way it used to work, right? So there's not a literal fog in your brain, but you're slowing down. Your cognition is changing. You're forgetting more. And unfortunately, with menopause, I'll tell you that's something I would not recommend to anyone. 1 star, do not recommend. But unfortunately, we don't get a choice. But your estrogen drops. And when your estrogen drops, it has a lot of impacts on your cognition and your emotional regulation, which mirrors ADHD symptoms very similarly. That's why if you go to a diagnostician, they will ask you about your pre-perimenopausal experience. They want to know, how long has this been prevalent in your life? Because menopause and ADHD can look very similar. And also, menopause can increase ADHD symptoms. So in my case, I did have ADHD my entire life, but I had a whole bunch of compensatory methods. I struggled a lot when I was a kid and teenager. And then I started working out when I was a teenager because I just didn't want to be overweight anymore. It was complete vanity that I started taking care of myself. And in doing so, in eating better, and I was a big runner and I was always very active, those became compensatory methods for the deficiencies in my thought process. So when I work out, I get a boost of oxygen to the brain and blood to the brain, blood flow to the brain, and it really helped me manage those symptoms. And I was still doing that when I entered perimenopause. But now all those compensatory methods, plus the onset of perimenopause where my estrogen is just tanks, now all of a sudden those compensatory methods aren't doing enough. And I'm starting to notice the deficits more. So that's how, it becomes like this crescendo as you get into perimenopause. And I laugh, but it's really not funny. It's a lot to deal with for any of us, really, whether you have ADHD or not, perimenopause and menopause. But those two coming together can be the catalyst for realizing, like, I can't go on this way anymore.
Thank you for that. Again, so much. I can't wait to do the show notes for this because you're leading us to so many resources. I'm curious about, as you come into this new understanding of how your brain works and rethinking how you're going to kind of re-engage with life, I guess, you at some point make a decision, I'm going to leave the career I have, the corporate career I have, and I'm going to go back into entrepreneurship. You said something at the top of the podcast about wanting to make sure that there was a good reason for going back into this and that it actually had some legs, is ultimately what I heard. Why ADHD? What happened for you that you were so struck by, or what provided, or what kind of clarity did you bump into that you said, this is it? This is the thing. This is what I want to teach. This is what I want to talk about. This is what I want to create content about. What was it about this particular thing versus just saying, oh gosh, now I have a whole new, instruction manual and I can go back into my corporate or consulting career with this new information?
Right. This is a great question. And there's a number of things there. First of all, I was ready to move on. Another trait of ADHDers is that they tend to get bored very easily in jobs and want to job hop a lot. So I was in that moment again. And the other thing, as I mentioned, we have very interest-driven brains. And when I got this diagnosis, I was fascinated to no end. And because it doesn't just it's not just an interesting topic, it's a topic that directly relates to my life. So because I have that emotional connection to it, made it all the more visceral, right? And then on top of that, I just love being a creator and creating and coaching and doing all of these things that I feel like I was meant for. So there was a lot of things going on in that. And also like just sort of at this point of midlife where it's like, I don't know how many more years in front of me I have versus behind me. So I don't want to waste them doing things that feel very ho-hum or boring. I want to go all in on the things that make the most sense for me. And the one other reason that I decided that this is what I wanted to do was I wanted full freedom over my time and energy. I wanted full agency over my schedule, because one thing I noted was that appointments and, a lot of calls and being on Zoom all the time in my career as a consultant was very draining to me. What I didn't think about is the fact that, well, once you're coaching, that's pretty much what you're doing too. Yeah. So that's why I wouldn't say quickly, I coached one-on-one for a couple of years before I thought, you know what, I'm getting far more satisfaction around the creation point and coaching one-to-many rather than one-on-one. So that's what made that pivot happen. But to answer your question, there was just like a culmination of a bunch of things and the timing was just right. And I found out about this coaching program and it just felt right in my bones, like nothing before had ever felt right. And to this day, I still feel that to be true. And I've been at this for about 4 years now, right? So usually at 4 years, I have gone through, I was consulting in corporate. So I wasn't an employee at LinkedIn, but I was consulting at LinkedIn. And I liked the consulting role because I was kind of jumping from company to company and it gave me that ability to learn new things all the time. But there was too many things outside of that in terms of a corporate career that were not working for my neurodivergent brain that I knew it was just time to move on.
And when you talk about the entrepreneurial aspects of coaching and creating content, those are very different things. Coaching is pretty clear, right? You're meeting with one person or a few people, and they're paying you for your time and your expertise. Versus when you're creating content, and I'm just going to say this, at a stage in life when the technology gap starts to feel a little bit bigger, that's another thing. And how did you decide? Some of it was done for you. You said as you were creating content, you just were coming to life, essentially. You were feeling driven by that and interested in that. How did you decide, though, or when did you decide, I'm going to actually go through whatever I need to go through to learn these different modalities to create content one-to-many, to understand the technologies that are available to me that weren't available even 4 years ago? Whether it's through social media or whether it's platforms, Notion, Kajabi, there's all sorts of different platforms that are used for various reasons. What made you say, okay, I like creating content so much that I'm going to go through relearning all these new platforms that are available to those who create content, and I'm going to lean into that? Because I asked this question because so many times I hear women saying, I'm just going to hang up whatever I'm doing because the technology gap is getting to be too big, and that seems to be the difference between those who are successful and those who aren't. So I asked that for that reason.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot as well. I will say I have the unfair advantage of, being in and out of entrepreneurship before. I had, a few years of using specific tools. And then I've always, even in corporate, I worked in tech. So tech is not something that scares me. But that's not the point, because I don't think tech is that hard. A lot of things scare me, but tech isn't one of them. I have a love of learning. If there's something that I'm interested in and I want to learn it, I will learn it. And with Notion, there is a learning curve there. But because I was so fascinated with it and I was so excited about it, you could not pull me away from my software. And I still feel that way. It's very exciting to me today. So to that, I would say, if someone wants to make a midlife change and they're afraid of the technology, I would check your mindset. Are you feeling like you can't teach an old dog new tricks, so you're not even trying? Mm-hmm. Or, I think that's one place to start. And second of all is you'll always have like some technology hiccups. Maybe you need to outsource some things. But the question I always ask my clients is the desire to do something greater than the fear or resistance you have to learning the technology around it? Because if the technology fear is up here at out of 10, but the desire to do something is only at a 5, then what that is a nice idea, but it's actually not something you want to follow through on. When your desire exceeds your fears, that's a good indication that, there's something here and you should keep pushing forward.
I love that. What a great question to ask ourselves, because for many of us, never mind if we have an ADHD diagnosis, these ideas come to mind and we want to act on them, and they feel very exciting and there's so much learning around them and they feel like they're worth our energy and our time. But I like the way you've presented that, because I think that's telling of something altogether different that's of equal importance, right? Like how important is this for you? How dedicated are you to this? And then that's probably an indicator of how much time you're going to spend on it and how long you're going to hang in there with that thing.
For sure. And one other litmus test that I think is really important is to ask yourself, do I want to have done the thing or do I want to actively do the thing? And my litmus test for that, or my example for that, is I've always wanted to be a marathon runner. I've always wanted to say that I run marathons, but there's no way that I ever want to do marathon training. So I know I had to let go of that dream of being a marathon runner, because the idea of training was so sucky to me that it wasn't worth having done the thing. Same thing if you want to be a published author. Do you want to be a published author, or do you want to be somebody who writes 500 words every day? Because that is somebody who's going to be a published author, not somebody who's just thinking about the outcome. So there's a lot of exploration that has to happen there whenever you have an idea. And it's good to have those reflections. And sometimes you just do it anyway and let the chips fall where they may, but don't make it a personal failure make it mean something about yourself if it doesn't work out.
Yeah. Man, where were you 20 years ago?
Struggling.
On
the struggle bus.
It took you that 20 years to get to this so you could tell me about that. Okay. I'll buy into that. No, that's awesome, Caren. Thank you for that. And again, I think for so many of us who are in this place where we're trying to think about what's next for a variety of reasons and circumstances, I think it's nice to have both of those litmus tests to really check ourselves and see, is this something we want to have done, have accomplished, or is this something that we want to do? I think that's brilliant. Thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit about your work with us, right? With us in getting diagnosed, with us in once we have the diagnosis. You talked about coaching more one-to-many. What are some of the things that you offer if our listeners go and check you out? What can they expect to find that they'll learn from Caren Magill, or different modules on Notion that they can extract from your years of wisdom? And that's years beyond the 4 that you dedicated to ADHD. That's also you growing up in it and knowing firsthand what some of those pain points are.
Sure. The main body of work that I have is on YouTube. And I think anyone who starts there is going, whether they have ADHD or not, is going to get a lot more of those tools that I just mentioned about measuring what's most important and what's not, because that's the foundation of everything I do. And then I do have several programs. They're not all Notion based, but the starter program I have is a Notion tool, although it's just the tool. It's really the content and meat of the program that I think helps people. And what that does is takes you through a couple of different assessments where you start to really understand what your priorities, values, strengths, and needs are as an individual. And then once you have those, then it guides you through a process of creating goals that are in alignment with who you are. So again, you don't have to have ADHD or not, but it is a helpful tool to understand, what you value before setting goals that, might be things you want to have done rather than, want to go through the process of. And then it helps you to break down goals into projects and tasks. And I don't know, maybe I missed the day in school when people were taught how to do that, but I did not learn these basic skills in school of how to take a big idea and break it down into something that, you can actually move forward with. So I talk a lot about that. And then I have a few other programs. Some are specific to entrepreneurship, where I help a burgeoning entrepreneur really understand, again, their values, what's important to them, how they want to build a business that works for their energy and their brain type, whether it's ADHD or not, and examine that before they build a business that becomes a prison, which I have done before. There's so many things you need to know about yourself before really diving into entrepreneurship. So that's another program I have. So I have a variety of different offerings depending on what folks are looking for. But I think the best place to really get more of what we're talking about here is starting with the YouTube channel or podcast, to really understand more about how it really is important to understand what you want out of life and prioritize from that point.
Yeah. And I appreciate that you said it's whether you have ADHD or not, because I have hopped on your YouTube and there's been several things that I'm like, I don't think I have ADHD. There are some tendencies that I have that are like ADHD, but I guess that's a part of my personality. But there were plenty of takeaways for me. I didn't feel, I could share that with anybody. So we will definitely link to that so people can check those out. And now, of course, I have to ask you, because it's the end of the show, how has building this platform of It's ADHD Friendly and all the various things that you've done within it, within the coaching, within the YouTube and the podcasting, how has all of this liberated you?
I love the word liberated, because I think that is perfect, a perfect word to describe how it has changed me. Moving from where I was before to where I am now, every choice I've made has been very intentional. And of course, always starting with what's most important to me and where is my energy and my brain at. And with every conscious choice that I've made and continue to make, and some of them are hard to make because everything sounds interesting, but I have to remind myself that as a sovereign human being, liberated, if you will, that I have agency over what I take in and what I don't take in, other people's agendas, other people's commitments. Very often we think we have to do these things, like, oh, I have to say yes to a birthday party, or, oh, I have to participate in the PTA or whatever. And we make those assumptions, but it's not actually true. And as long as we are living in a free country, we have the agency to say no to certain things. But it starts with knowing who you are and what works for you and what doesn't. And saying no can sometimes be a really beautiful and caring and honest thing to say. It doesn't have to be confronting or rigid, because the more we give ourselves permission to say no to the things that don't align for us, the more we give permission to the people around us to also say no and to be equally liberated. So for me, liberation, and this I think is also just a wisdom thing of being in my 50s now and not being a people pleaser quite so much. Learning to say no to the things that I know are not going to be appropriate for me, even though they might sound absolutely fabulous, has been my biggest point of liberation, both in my business and in my personal life.
It feels like you're doing midlife really, really well. Thank you, Caren, for sharing so much wisdom. My gosh, I thought we were going to be focused on ADHD, but you've just given us all these life lessons as well. Thank you for spending this time with us. I so appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And Liberty listeners, thank you guys for hanging out with me and with Caren. We'll have everything she mentioned in the show notes so you guys can access it for yourself. And until next week, we'll see you then. Bye for now. Liberty Road is broadcast on all platforms: Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcast, and more. If you like what you've heard, please follow, rate, and review Liberty Road on Apple Podcast and Spotify. It helps us to know if these episodes are inspiring and equipping you to move into your middle third with intention. Liberty Road is created by executive producer Netta Jones, supervising producer Elizabeth Wyndham, producer Julia Wyndham, and music by Jack Jones.
At Leidos, a brilliant mind is smart, but a brilliant team is smarter. A ship that finds enemy subs is smart, but an autonomous fleet, that's smarter. Defending against cyber attacks? Smart. Stopping attacks before they start? Smarter. And using AI tools is smart, but integrating trusted mission AI into your technology is smarter. We're not just making technology solutions in national security and health. We're making smart smarter. Leidos.